Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I would then hand over to David Schilling to do some introductions for this webinar, and just to take you through the agenda. So he will do the welcome and introductions, then we'll hear from some introductions from Anna Pot and Felicitas Weber, and then we will do some moderated questions and answers with the rest of the panel. David, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. This is David Schilling from the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, a Senior Program Director for Human Rights. I also work with Paloma Munoz-Quick, who is a Program Director for the new Investor Alliance for Human Rights. And we are so happy to be partnering with the PRI, with KnowTheChain, with CIHRBE in this webinar. We think this is a critical issue, and we're glad that you're joining this call, because I believe that there'll be some information that is really germane to the work of investors as we're grappling with the whole process of how do we apply ESG, particularly looking at the S today, which is fundamentally around the framework of human rights. First, a couple of issues related to housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, and that the recording will be available on PRI's YouTube channel later. Also, for the Q&A session at the end, you can submit your questions using the Q&A box in the bottom right corner of the screen, and you can do those as we go forward, and then we'll get to that session later. And please submit those so that we can have a robust conversation after the presentations. So I think a couple of quick things. One, that as we look at any supply chain, and especially if we look at the labor supply chain of the apparel sector, there are so many salient issues that impact workers and communities and impact companies and their performance. We can think of Rana Plaza, the seafood issues around forced labor, low wages and long hours, toxics in the workplace. And we look at the framework that is available to us since 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights Framework, which I believe really establishes the ongoing risk management process, the human rights due diligence, which enables companies and investors to identify, prevent, mitigate, remedy any adverse human rights impacts that they are involved with, and through their business activities or, of course, any of the relationships through their supply chain, and then account for how they are meeting this responsibility. So as investors looking at the whole process with an ESG mindset, we see that within the S, the human rights framework is really absolutely critical for companies to take not only take a look, but embed within their processes the human rights due diligence. And when you look at the program for today, starting with the corporate human rights benchmark, there have been 2 reports thus far. And the information around the 3 sectors, the apparel sector, the extractive sector, the food product sector, there is a tremendous amount of ability to discern where companies are focused on human rights through the human rights due diligence process and where they are not. It's an indispensable tool for investors as well as for companies to look at where they stand vis-a-vis their peers and how they're really not only putting policies in place, but then implementing those and moving towards greater improvement of performance. And then with the KnowTheChain, what an amazing program that has been in terms of reports, from 2016, now in 2018, again on the apparel sector and footwear, on the ICT sector, food and beverage sector, providing investors, companies, and stakeholders with in-depth knowledge about what companies are doing to mitigate the risks to workers in terms of forced labor. So I think that today we're going to be looking at those tools as critical to the investor responsibilities to respect human rights and to look at it through the point of view of investment decisions as well as active engagements with companies. And just parenthetically here, the ICCR's Human Rights Working Group has utilized both in its engagements with companies and more recently taking the KnowTheChain Apparel and Footwear report from December of 2018, just last week, sending letters of commendation to the top 6 companies that performed well. And now we're looking at the bottom 20, which is a different letter that essentially pinpoints where progress needs to be made. So let's get into the conversation. First, we'll hear from Anna Pott, Manager of Responsible Investments for APG, and active in the Investor Alliance and with ICCR and other movements, and a part of the chair, being a part of the board of the CIHRBE. Then Felicitas Weber, KnowTheChain project lead for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, who has had a lot of experience working with investors coming from PRI and giving a lot of great leadership to the KnowTheChain project. And then William Anderson will be hearing from you as we engage in the Q&A from Adidas, a company that really scored on top of the recent KnowTheChain. So excellent lineup. Anna, we're interested in hearing your perspectives and getting us off to a good start.
Thank you, David. Excellent introduction. I'm happy to be here, and thank you all for joining in this call. My name is Anna Pott. I work for APG Asset Management, and at APG we invest pension savings of people in the Netherlands, ABP, our pension fund clients, and others. And we do that, indeed, we're taking seriously that investor responsibility that David was talking about, but in investing the savings of our participants in the scheme in companies that do good, in good companies, that provide a return on our investment and do that in a responsible manner. And human rights is a clear area that we look at. And in order to do that, in order to find these companies, these good companies that respect human rights, we need to have data. We need to have data to find those good companies, to do our research, but also we need to have data to engage with these companies in a meaningful way. And that, if we go to the next slide, is one of the reasons why we as APG have invested and really are part of this important initiative, the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And representing APG on the board of the CIHRBE, really glad to be in that position and to work together with our friends in other investors, but also our friends with civil society organizations and really experts on the field. Because what we are achieving with want to achieve with the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, what we have in common is that we want to see better performance from companies on human rights. And one way to spur that, one way to contribute to that is to define this program to see this race to the top. This benchmark, we hope, will help spur this race to the top and companies be challenged, be better informed, and be encouraged to do better in terms of respecting human rights. And as David pointed it out so elegantly, there's no reason to be complacent. We cannot. No, there is this need to better performance of companies on human rights. So quite urgently, we see this need. So as I said, we are a group of investors and civil society organizations, really experts in the field who could represent this local stakeholder perspective again, with in mind to make sure we have a tool that investors like us can use. We started with the CIHRBE in 2013 to really define a good method that meets all these requirements, did a lot of stakeholder engagement to come up with a good process and a good product and a good methodology that resulted eventually in 2017 in our first pilot benchmark. Last year, and many of you have seen that and have also been part of our show that we did in November, presenting proudly our second iteration of the benchmark. And if you go to the next slide, a couple of words about, okay, what about this methodology and what is it that the CIHRBE is assessing? As David said, the UN guiding principles present an excellent framework that we can all benefit from. And that's what we did as well at the CIHRBE. Our methodology is really inspired and based upon this framework of the corporate human rights benchmark, where we really wanted to capture not only the policies that companies have, but really also the practices. How does it work out in your management system? How does it work out on specific areas in your practice? And really give space to assess the performance of these companies. I must say that has been quite a critical point also in our engagement with stakeholders in the first round and then also in the second round of our methodology. How do you capture, not only words on paper, policies, but really how do you give space to the performance of these companies? Because again, what we want to achieve is better performing companies that respect human rights in practice. Again, that resulted in this benchmark that we have now done for the second time, an assessment of 101 companies in 3 different sectors, really with the aim to expand the scope to more companies in the future. If I have not said that, I want to reiterate really this, the outcome, the product, is an open source product that is available to everyone. Everyone can assess all our methodology and all the findings on our website, as we really believe this open space tool is what will bring that race to the top. If we go to the next slide, the 2018 results. We, as I said, last November presented our first real benchmark, as we would like to call it. The first one was really a pilot, but in practice, it was the second iteration of our benchmarks, where we have assessed these 3 different sectors. And as you can see, the apparel sector is one of those sectors that we have assessed, next to extractives and agriculture products. And as you can see on these figures, on these bar charts, is that, again, no reason to be complacent. The results are really skewed to the lower bands. Many laggards, not enough leaders, or hardly any leaders. So if you look, for instance, on the apparel companies, you see there's 30 companies that have been assessed. There's only 1 company in the highest score. And maybe no coincidence that we have this company represented on this call. So yes, we have 1 company in the apparel that scores in the highest band, but still 9 companies in the lowest. So out of 30 companies, 9 companies. That's quite a bit. That we hope to see going forward, showing better. And then maybe we can click to the next slide, where we have the 3 results. The results for the 3 sectors listed. Again, that you can also find on our website. The first one is the agriculture product, and the second one is about the apparel companies. So maybe we can pause here for a second to have a closer look at these 2018 results for these apparel companies. Biggest moves compared to the 2017 results is we have a new leader. Previously, it was Marks & Spencer was the leader. This year, as you can see, it's Adidas, who made a big change in scores, almost 30 points more than the year before, resulting in a top position, in the first position in this sector. We see also other big movers in this space were Marks & Spencer and VF. They have changed the scores quite significantly. But what's also good to say here is that there are several companies in here who have the same scores, those same points, but changed in their ranking. And of course, that's only logical if you think about it's a ranking where, if other companies move up, you go down if you do not change and keep up with that same speed of changing and improvements. Generally, yes, there has been an upward trend. We're glad to say that. But as I said before, still 9 companies out of the 30 in the lowest band. That's still a reason to act on this. One area maybe to specify, to name here, is that in terms of the actual scores, what we see with many of these companies is that they're doing quite okay in terms of policies. There's clearly an awareness of this, but still they lack on, generally speaking, on the remedy indicators. That's an area where really these companies in these sectors need to be encouraged to do more and really act on issues that are found in their practices. If we move on, next one is the extractives results. You can all see that also on our website and in our reports if you want to learn more about these specific results. But maybe for the sake of this call, let's move on to the next slide, progress since 2017. To pause here for a second to highlight to you the changes that we have made and really the lessons learned from our first pilot benchmark. Because, and you will hear that also in other benchmarks, it's not an easy task to serve all interest groups and to really come up with a benchmark that that really meets all these requirements and that reflects both policies and practices in a meaningful way. One lesson learned that we took up from our engagement and our stakeholder review after the pilot benchmark is that we have, for instance, introduced half points, because what we got back from the engagement with the companies on our research is that companies did not always feel well rewarded on initiatives that they have introduced, but not maybe in all cases meet our full point set that we have set out in our methodology. Also, we made some changes in terms of the transparency set of indicators. But the question that you might ask, okay, how much of the change in the outcomes have then been are due to the methodology change, and how much is it a real improvement, and how could we compare the 2 different years of results? Well, roughly speaking, we say that about 1/3 of the changes are due to the methodology change, but really 2/3 still could be allocated, could be attributed to an increase of the increase could be attributed to an actual change of this company's performance. So no, you cannot compare the 2 benchmarks to 2017 and 2018 in full, but still, and that's how we use it also in my organization. it really gives you a good indication of where these companies are going. So maybe if you go to the next slide, couple of key messages that we reiterate and could also be seen in our report that we have produced of our latest benchmark. They're all listed here. I'm not going to go over all of these, but really one point that we also as an investor and in our research and review of companies, but also in our engagement with companies, take quite strongly, is that these companies, yes, they're improving. Yes, there's more policy of most of these companies, but really what is lacking is actual due diligence of these companies, due diligence management systems to really follow up on their policy commitments. And we call this here, really these companies need to get better at walking the talk by really matching their commitments with a clear and consistent action, for instance, by introducing a solid due diligence mechanism in their programs. If you go to the last slide, almost last slide, one other aspect that I found really important also that we bring up in our engagement with these companies is that, yes, it's great that these companies talk about and respond on allegations more and more. For instance, the Business Human Rights Resource Center is a great example, a great tool where you can see that, and also where companies could show their response. But again, it's words on paper. These companies really should follow up and go out to these people who are affected on the ground by their human rights impacts. So actual talk with the people who are in the countries, who are in Brazil or other places where still there's these human rights concerns out and about. Make sure that you follow up and have that engagement at a local level to really make sure you understand the issues, you provide remedy, and you can learn and improve for next time. So that was one item that I want to single out from these key messages on that last slide. That brings me to the last slide, call to action. We as the CIHRBE not only provide this data, we provide this open source tool that all stakeholders could use in their engagement and research and review, how we use it as investors, but also, this engagement and follow-up with the companies is a very clear one that we act upon. I'm aware we're going to talk about the investor engagement at the end of the call. I'm happy to share with you what we have done in that space and also what we're currently doing, how you could join our initiatives. But I wanted to reiterate that this is just the CIHRBE. It's just the research and the data. It's about acting upon that and really make these companies better and have this race to the top. I'll leave it here.
Thank you. Now we're going to hear from Felicitas Weber. And you just let us know about changing your slides, Felicitas, as well.
Thank you so much, Elena. I'm really glad to be here with you today. My name is Felicitas Weber. I'm with the Business and Human Rights Research Center, and we are one of the 5 partners of KnowTheChain. So if we go to the next slide, like similar to the corporate human rights benchmark, KnowTheChain is a collaboration really bringing together expertise of different partners. We have 2 foundations, Humanity United and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. We have a labor consultancy, Verite, as well as the ESG research provider, Sustainalytics, that are part of this project. KnowTheChain really is a resource for both companies, but also investors to understand and address forced labor risks within global supply chains. So we currently focus on 3 sectors at high risk of forced labor: the electronic sector, the food sector, and the apparel sector. And in those sectors, we undertake benchmarks every 2 years. We also have a couple of other products. So we have done in the past deep dives into commodities. We did a study of modern slavery statements in the ICT sector, and we're currently working on a report on good practices across those three sectors. So if we go to the next slide. So what we did in 2018, David alluded to that. So we looked at 119 of the largest global companies in these three sectors. Also looking at selecting companies that have a significant portion of revenues from own branded products, given they have more leverage in those cases. And in the case of ICT companies, we also looked at companies that have a large percentage of revenues from physical products as opposed to services, given the risks in manufacturing and mineral sourcing. So given we are looking at the largest companies, our sort of regional coverage tends to be a little bit skewed towards the US and Canada. So you'll see here on the slide around 40% of our companies are from North America, 25 from Asia, 25 from Europe, and the remaining 10% really a combination from companies from the remaining regions of the world. We, as part of these engagements, benchmarks, we also engage quite extensively with companies, both ahead of the benchmark, but also following the benchmark publication. Across the three sectors, we engaged with around just over 3/4 of the companies that we benchmarked, and 67% of the companies also provided additional disclosure, so disclosure in addition to what's already on their own website. We are benchmarking companies against 7 themes that you see here on the slides. So these are all weighted equally. They were developed based on the UN guiding principles, so looking at commitment, due diligence, and remedy. And 2 themes I quickly wanted to call out specifically are recruitment and worker voice. So these are really 2 themes that you see here on average where companies across the 3 sectors score the lowest. Recruitment is very much looking at how do companies avoid exploitation of migrant workers through recruitment agencies or employment agencies. So by having clear policies in place, such as the employer pays principle, but also by demonstrating clear steps towards that. So, for example, reimbursing recruitment fees to workers, supporting ethical recruitment in their supply chains, or working with suppliers to ensure migrant worker rights are respected. And worker voice has become quite a buzzword, but just also to say what we mean here, we are very much looking at unionization, but also how companies engage workers in their supply chains on their right and empower them to enforce their rights, to really increase worker agencies. Part of that is also grievance mechanism that we look at, so to what extent companies make sure that supply chain workers have access to grievance mechanisms. As an example, Anna mentioned remedy. So here we do look whether a company has a process to respond to grievances, but then we also want to see concrete examples of remedy provided to supply chain workers. So we're typically asking for 2 examples, just to see that this wasn't just a blip in time and maybe at some point a company did provide remedy because there was a lot of pressure, but really asking for 2 concrete examples. If we actually identified forced labor allegations with a company, we ask them to provide a response to that, but also then to demonstrate how they provided remedy to workers, something that, as Anna mentioned, is very much lacking. Now, if we move to the next slide, I wanted to talk today specifically about our apparel and footwear benchmark. So here we looked at 43 of the largest global companies that includes retailers, footwear companies, luxury brands, and suppliers. And if we go to the next slide. So just briefly, David mentioned there's so many salient issues in apparel supply chains, and there has been a lot of focus on poor wages and working conditions and health and safety, which is fantastic, but I think there is still sort of a catch-up to do on forced labor in that particular sector. So why does forced labor occur and what does it look like? So there are a lot of vulnerable populations in apparel supply chains, including migrant workers, including women workers. And if we look at some of the more leading companies that actually disclose audit findings, including from lower tiers of their supply chains, they did actually sometimes find quite stark findings of workers having to pay recruitment fees up to $7,000, or factories where over 80% of the workers had their passports withheld and hence couldn't leave the factory or the country. And those risks are very much present across supply chain tiers, as you see here on the slide. Now, if we go to the next slide. So these are our 2018 results. I think if you just look at this graphic, I think what I always find quite stark is that there's this wide disparity of scores. So the average score is 37 out of 100. But really, if you look at this graphic, there's no such thing as an average company. So you have scores all the way from 92 to 0. And you see here Adidas and Lululemon scoring on the top, the highest scoring companies, due to their very strong approaches in those two critical areas, so related to recruitment and migrant workers, but also due to the fact that they do take action to address risks in lower tiers of their supply chain, so going beyond the first tier. So for example, these two companies have provided evidence that workers below the first tier have access to grievance mechanisms and have used those grievance mechanisms. What is interesting as well, if you look at the lower scoring company, that these aren't really a uniform group. So you see companies across subsectors and across region. So you have Asian retailers, for example, like Seijing Simir Garments, that owns China's largest specialty children's apparel brand. You have Shimamura, the second largest apparel retailer in Japan. But you also have US companies like the footwear companies Foot Locker and Skechers that score quite low, or European luxury brands like LVMH and Prada. And I'd like you to keep the distribution of this graphic in your mind when we move to the next slide. So you'll hopefully see, if we just zoom in on recruitment, that this is really an area where companies score very, very low. So the average score is only 18 out of 100. So less than half of the average score across the 7 themes. And there's 18 companies that only score 0. So that's over 40% of those 43 companies. If we go to the next slide, I also wanted to talk about what has changed over time. Are we moving in the right direction? So David and Anna mentioned there's no reason to be complacent, and I think that's absolutely right. So unfortunately, if we look at those 2 themes that I mentioned, worker voice and recruitment, these incredibly crucial themes that have a direct impact on workers' lives, these remain among the lowest scoring themes. So you see here the scores for the apparel benchmark, with recruitment and worker voice being marked in gray. And if we look at the company sample, when we first did this benchmark in 2016, we actually had a higher average score than in 2018. Now, if we move to the next slide, on the other hand, always 2 sides to a coin. In 2018, we expanded our list from 20 companies to 43, meaning that we included a number of smaller companies. So I think it is to be expected that these scores go down. And actually, if we only look at the 19 companies that we both benchmarked in both years, it is really positive that that the average score has increased from 49 to 56. Which doesn't sound that much, but given that we changed the methodology and made it harder to score higher, companies that didn't make any improvements at all actually typically decreased their score from between 8 to 10 points. So I think this improvement here is really quite positive. What was also positive, that actually all of the 19 companies that we benchmarked in this sector improved. This wasn't the case in the other 2 sectors. And it's really exciting as well that that obviously includes the high-scoring companies, but it also includes the mid-scoring companies and the lower-scoring companies. What was interesting as well that we have seen improvements across those 7 themes. So there's not any particular area where companies improved, but looking at these 19 companies, for example, 9 companies had strengthened their training programs for internal staff or suppliers. 10 companies provided more information on stakeholder engagement. 6 companies published supplier list. 3 more companies disclosed evidence of reimbursing recruitment fees to workers, which doesn't sound a lot, but given there was only 1 before, 3 additional 1 is quite good. And 4 more companies established grievance mechanisms for workers in their supply chains. What's also been positive that following our benchmark research, in October last year, the American Apparel and Footwear Association and the Fair Labor Association came out with a statement that was signed by over 120 brands that made a commitment to responsible recruitment. So to really improve in this area, that's where currently the sector is really lagging behind. I realize I'm a little bit over time, so maybe we'll leave it here and we can go to the remaining slides if we have time. Thank you.
Very much, Felicitas and Anna, for those presentations. That was quite informative, and it's good to see that the results from the 2 benchmarks, and it's good to know that there's still time to a lot of work to do. In that sense, and then I would like to go into the questions and answers session of part of this session, and I would like to start with Bill. And to give you a little bit of an introduction. Bill Anderson is the head of social and environmental affairs for the Asia Pacific region in Adidas. He has lived and worked in Asia for the past 20 years as an environmental advisor to governments and a business and a human rights lawyer and ethics manager. Thank you, Bill, for joining us today. Yes, I wanted just to go through a couple of questions in terms to get a little bit of better idea of how these results then work in practice. So if we can start, if you can explain to us and the audience a little bit, how do you address forced labor risk in your supply chains, particularly looking at lower tiers of supply chain and in challenging sourcing contexts?
Yes, thank you so much. A pleasure to be with you on the call. I think I pick up on Anna was describing in the assessments for the CIHRBE that the reason why Adidas scores highly on things is because we're a practice-driven program. Our practices informed our policies and our approaches. And in particular in the forced labor area, we started researching that topic way back in 2003 and 4, firstly in Malaysia, which was then a major apparel sourcing country. It is today. But, we basically reached out with support from ActionAid, was one of the organizations we worked with, to define what the issues were for the migrant labor, particularly Bangladeshis and the smaller numbers of Burmese people prior to it becoming Myanmar. And we worked very closely in engaging directly with workers to understand what the challenges that they had. That work informed our guidelines, our guidance that we developed, and that in turn informed the DACA principles that were subsequently developed in 2011. So we kind of introduced and contributed to that. So that's the first thing I say is that fundamentally you have to understand what is happening on the ground if you have any prospect of providing a remedy for those challenges. What we've done, particularly in the Tier 2 space, which I think, again, reflects a little bit on our leadership efforts, is that we've dedicated an individual to lead our modern slavery program. And what we've sought to do is map high-risk areas, in particular to track even down to Tier 3 in our leather production in respect to cotton. 100% of our cotton is made with Better Cotton Initiative. We've launched an initiative recently that is focused around the rubber industry, and 100% of our rubber is sourced through Vietnam, and we're doing that in the FLA. So we have one strategy which is to target areas which are of particular focus and interest to us. Leather, tanneries, and cattle farming in Brazil. We've examined and looked at the risk profile in that country as well. And then in the tier above that, if we look at the actual materials production and the subordinate factories to our primary factories, we've been running what we've been calling a modern slavery outreach program, which is a training initiative that complements the labor compliance program that we've had in place now for 20 years. So it's this multi-layered effort with slightly different strategies for different elements of the tiers, but all of it built around directly what the migrant worker issues are. I'll stop there.
Yeah. So I guess the next question will be, I mean, as you mentioned, it's good to know that practice as inform your policy. It's really good that you have that feedback loop in terms of creating your policies and also updating them. I think, well, one of the issues that were mentioned in the presentations is that remedy is one of the sections that scores really low in both benchmarks. So I would like to understand a little bit more, well, what is Adidas' approach to remedy? And a little bit if you can explain to us, what is the role of the buyer and what is the role of the supplier in providing remedy? Where do you see the line and how do you work in those cases?
Yeah, so if I speak to our standard, our labor monitoring program, which is the core work that we do, essentially, again, we've tried to build an integrated or layered process. So, we have still auditing, and we have what we call performance audits, which are for our main factories. I should actually perhaps preface this with the fact that 80% of our product is made in only 110 factories, because over the past 10 years, we've consolidated considerably our supply chain. So what we do and how we address things is somewhat different than perhaps the fashion industry brand that might have a much bigger footprint that they're seeking to manage. But essentially what we're doing again in this layered process is that we've got dedicated staff on the ground. We've kept ownership, as it were, of the monitoring processes and of the capacity building processes, but we partner with the factories in terms of driving remedy, including their efforts in our subcontracting space. We might, trust but verify conditions, but that informs the remedies required, and then we look for the main primary partners to help support the delivery of the remedy. So that effort, I think, has worked well. That strategy and approach has been successful. And also in support of remedy, and you mentioned, Felicitas, about workers' voice, we've actually invested fairly heavily in trying to build a factory operational mechanism across all of our key suppliers. It's not 100% coverage yet, but it's very well on that way to achieve. And that lets us look into the factory's own grievance management processes and to see hotspots and issues we wouldn't hear through our separate program that we run through a hotline services. And to date, in the past year, we have tracked 21,000 cases in terms of remedy issues in the factories. So that has been a helpful step in having a deeper insight in factory level efforts that complements the more standardized audit, which is safety and labor conditions, pay, the standard things. And in complementing that, we also have a worker satisfaction survey that we run through our factories to give us a different touch point into the worker's voice, which is outside of a grievance mechanism, a complaint mechanism. So these things are important to inform the remedies that needs to be done. And the satisfaction surveys actually trigger direct improvement by the factories. So we're not doing corrective action plans, which is traditional. We're actually asking them to look at the results and then think for themselves how they improve the working situation, the workers' lives. So it's quite a slightly different dynamic than the tick box check audit mechanism.
Great, thank you very much. That's quite interesting. And I guess Well, my last question to you for this session, before I go to the other panelists as well, is I just wanted to know a little more about how has been your experience in with doing these benchmarks, and a little bit is to understand what benefits do you see in participating in initiatives like this, and what would you recommend other companies looking into doing or improving in these benchmarks?
Yeah, I think it's really very helpful. Partly, I believe that we score highly because we've always had a very strong transparency drive within our organization, and we publish a lot of materials, and we have a lot of policy materials and other guidance documentation that explains what we do, which I think when you look to the smaller entities in the longer tail that you show in your graph, particularly the Asian-based firms, they simply don't have that level of public disclosure, or maybe even the sophistication of systems and materials. So perhaps that's resulting in lower scores for them. But certainly, I think the benchmarking processes are valuable because every business needs to reflect on what the expectations are from its stakeholders, including the investment community. And we've been quite reflective of that. We identify gaps. We look at ways that we can improve. Even though we believe we've got a very mature program, particularly in our supply chain work, that's 20 years old, it doesn't stop at any given point. It has to continue to be improved. So I think they're very beneficial, and I'm a strong supporter of them.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much. So actually, we do have a question from the audience that I think it's relevant for the answer you just gave, and they are asking you if there are greater costs in the Adidas approach, not just in terms of due diligence costs, but in terms of the cost of materials and labor for suppliers. And if so, like, do you know what percentage of the final product cost just this particular policies and processes represent?
We absorb those costs. In our program, like maybe some brands which have very large third-party programs which are paid for by the suppliers, mostly our program is funded through the company directly. So, I mean, I have the privilege to work with 70 other people, and so we have this very much local embedded in each of the key sourcing countries, staff that are dedicated to this function, as opposed to, we do use third-party auditors for selective work, particularly to do with our licensee business. But there is no, in that sense, cost to suppliers from the client's work that we're running. Of course, there is remedy and there is improvements that they do, but upholding legal requirements and overtime premiums and all of these things are direct obligations for them.
Yeah. Sure. I think a related question as well is just that I guess investors are interested to know whether this is something that you can afford because of the Adidas brand, or do you think the so-called low-cost brands could afford to have the same processes and policies in place?
Yes, I believe so. I think the overall cost of an internalized team with the kind of expertise that we hold is something we've built over many, many years, of course. So that maybe the greater cost for any other business to replicate that would be the time and energy to create such a mature team. But I think there has to be a balance between the externalizing of, say, auditing services. I know that's come in criticism in recent cases, particularly regarding fire safety and building safety. I think the businesses must reach a balance between management, but also enough technical knowledge internal to the programs that they can make the right call, the right decisions. So I can't speak for any given brand. It's hard to replicate exactly the history and development of our program compared to others.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think that's useful for our audience. And I think, well, going back to Anna and Felicitas, I mean, given that we have two benchmarks in this presentation, I think an important question is to understand how both benchmarks work together. What are the key differences and similarities? And a little bit, if you can say, well, how investors can use both methodologies and assessments.
Yeah, happy to go ahead, Anna, if that sounds good.
Yeah,
you can add to it?
go.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to start with, I think there's a little bit of a different scope of the two benchmarks. So CIHRBE covers also own operations in addition to supply chains, depending on the business model, whereas KnowTheChain focuses only on supply chains, but therefore also goes in more detail beyond the first tier and what companies are doing in different tiers. And CIHRBE also looks at a range of key sector risks. So in apparel, for example, that includes women's rights, includes health and safety, whereas KnowTheChain really only focuses on forced labor very specifically. And I think that's also where quite a bit of the score difference comes from. So you, for those of you that have a good memory, so the average apparel score for KnowTheChain was 37 and for CIHRBE 26, so quite a bit lower. But in the space of forced labor, we've really seen that legislative reporting requirements like California or Modern Slavery Act in the UK have really meant that companies have often started to put in place forced labor specific policies or information that might be sufficient for KnowTheChain, but not for corporate human rights benchmark, whereas they're looking at a range of human rights practices, and things like a human rights defenders policy, for example, are just a lot more rare. In terms of similarities, I think we both focus on human rights and the supply chain and large global companies. We look predominantly at public disclosure, but also integrate third-party allegation. I myself am part of the Business and Human Rights Research Center. We're part of both initiatives, so really trying to align that way to make sure we have some of the CIHRBE staff regularly actually in our offices to work together on a nearly weekly basis to align in terms of research timelines. We do quality checks. We've done indicator mappings that we shared with companies, also invited them, if, for example, they only responded to CIHRBE or KTC, to just share that information with the other benchmark. And I think there's a lot of learning and indicator alignment as well going on. So for us, for example, it's been really helpful that CIHRBE has done integrated allegations the year before us, so we could learn a lot and have taken over their learnings and their approach on how to treat allegations, for example. Sorry, I've gone on quite extensively, Anna, but not sure if you want to add to that.
That's great. That's great, and I think that's really good. And exactly, I agree. We really, yes, there's differences, but there is a lot of commonality, and at least we share the same goal to really provide investors and other stakeholders with that data about human rights performance of these companies, and for the KnowTheChain really focusing on the supply chain and forced labor. So really a call that brings me to the next point. It's really a call to action to investors to use that data, in their investments, in their research, and use that data to discuss it with the companies that you invest in. And maybe that brings me also to the last two slides, where we have summed up on what we have done in the context of the corporate human rights benchmark in terms of finding this alignment and joint action from investors to engage with these companies. Because that's in the end what it's all about. It's about bringing these companies to a next stage in respecting human rights. So just briefly, in 2017, after the results of the pilot benchmarks were published, we have, together with other investors, reached out to all these companies to highlight the importance and define a set of investor expectations on these companies, and really challenge them on being better in the benchmark and doing better in their performance. That led to 29 companies responded in a formal way by writing us letters and having calls and correspondence following up on our letter. Not all companies have responded. Some of them in more detail, more depth than others, but also in engagement that we as APG do with these companies, sometimes also outside of this a collaborative engagement effort, we hear positive responses from these companies that they don't always agree with the outcomes and what's in the benchmark, but they really value it, and they read it, they review it, and they use it in their own internal discussions. So it's there and it's helpful. That brings me to the last slide. As you can expect, we're doing this investor outreach again based on the latest results. We are currently finalizing a letter to these companies to remind them of the results and continue with the engagement based on the 2018 results. If you want to join or get involved in any way or hear more about how we go about it, please feel free to contact me or to contact the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark. And we're happy to have you join the club.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anna and Felicitas. And I guess, Bill, I want to pass the forum to you and ask you on the other side of things. Well, what is your experience with engaging with investors on these issues, and what do you think are the actions investors should take to really see this going further?
Yeah, I think the CIHRBE has really triggered a higher level of interest. I remember when I met David at the Human Rights Forum 2 years back, I volunteered to meet with a couple of Adidas investors, and that group turned from 2 to 21 people who wanted to talk about our score in the pilot of the CIHRBE. So I think it really concentrates attention to important topics and important conversations that any investor relations people within any of the brands should be taking note of, and should themselves be bringing in the relevant compliance and people like myself in the rights area. So that's what it does. And the other thing I'd appeal to the investor community is get out there and look at things on the ground. I think it's very important for both the buyers and the suppliers to know the interest from the investment community about these critical human rights concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. And David, one question for you is what should investors have done to ensure that investee companies in the apparel sector respect labor rights in their supply chain? And so in your opinion, what else can investors do to make sure that human rights are respected in supply chain?
Well, there's been a lot of work in the investor community for a long time, engaging companies directly on supply chain issues. I think now we have a moment where we're clearly, here we have identified some of the human rights risks to communities and workers through the CIHRBE, and particularly forced labor on KnowTheChain. So investors picking those resources up and utilizing them, and really scrutinize their own portfolios as to how they're managing their own investor respect for human rights. And then secondly, just to underscore what Bill said, I think in our work at ICCR and with others as well, important to get policies in place in companies that utilize the human rights due diligence, but you also need to get to the ground. And I think you're absolutely right, Bill. Important for investors to go. For example, there were investor groups we've been a part of that have, right after Rana Plaza and over time, have gone to Bangladesh. We've had delegations to different parts of Asia, but also looking at some of the grassroots organizations that are there. Trade unions, right now I'm a part of the leadership group for responsible recruitment, which is about 17 companies, International Organization Migration, Verite, ICCR. But I felt it was so important to have worker voice at the table. So the Migrant Forum Asia, which is a combination of NGOs and trade unions working with migrant workers in the Asian region, are part of that. I think the other piece is pay attention to real important reports like Transparentum, which is really focused on responsible recruitment in Malaysia, apparel sector, and that report will be coming out publicly soon. So, ICCR and the Alliance will be helping to organize follow-up to some of those reports, because it really, if you take the combination of CIHRBE, KnowTheChain, and then put it in place with active engagements with companies, it seems like that plus the on-the-ground information of what's happening there can make a huge difference. Because I think right now with the American Apparel Footwear Association, FLA, that's really important that the pillars that we've been focusing on, no worker paid fees, no confiscation of passports, written contracts at the point of recruitment, all of that has been embraced. But now the hard work begins in terms of implementation and really getting suppliers engaged and involved with recruiters to change the model from having workers pay so much that they end up in a workplace really under a bonded labor, forced labor, slave labor situation. And so that's beginning to happen. So I think the investors should see some of the initiatives like the Responsible Labor Initiative in the electronic sector, and that's been broadened to other sectors that are really looking at getting the recruitment system radically changed. So I think we can look at some of those high points of where collective action is actually becoming action with companies, with suppliers, with investors, and trade unions and groups on the ground. So I'm hopeful that the combination of the companies like Adidas with sector initiatives that are taking place can move the needle, and investors can really ask companies, so how are you engaged and involved in trying to address some of these systemic issues with your peers, your sector associations, and multi-stakeholder initiatives?
Yes, thank you very much, David. Well, we're running out of time for this webinar, so I will thank the panelists for your presentations and your comments. It's been greatly useful and very informative. Thank you so much for everyone who joined and participated today. We will send, as mentioned, the recording will be available, and please feel free to share your questions with us, and we'll make sure to get back with an answer from the different panelists. So we'll enjoy the rest of the evening, afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.